Oh, hi there. My name is Francis. I'm Liam's stepdad. I heard you guys are learning about the Middle Ages. Well, when I was 9 and in primary school, we studied the Middle Ages too. And the big event that I remember learning about the most was 1066 and the Battle of Hastings. Learning about that battle at school left a big impression on me. And not just because it was exciting and there was fighting and swords and stuff, but because of an amazing piece of art that was created a couple of years later to record the events of that battle. It's called the Bayeux Tapestry, and it's pretty cool because it's basically the first comic book in English. This is the Bayeux Tapestry, in all its woolly glory. The tapestry is 78 metres long and about a metre wide. It's made out of wool, coloured with vegetable dyes and stitched onto a linen backing cloth. The tapestry tells the story of the events that led up to the Battle of Hastings in great detail. Such great detail, in fact, that it's pretty much one of the biggest reasons why people still talk about the Battle of Hastings to this day. Now, I know I said the tapestry was a comic book written in English, but okay, I fibbed. The captions are actually written in Latin, which is the written language most people used back then. Not that that matters much. Hardly anyone in the Middle Ages could read in the first place, and that's one of the things that makes the tapestry so interesting. It's not a history recorded in a dusty book that only rich scholars could enjoy. It was designed so that everyone, from the greatest lord to the lowliest peasant, could see and enjoy the story of the conquest for themselves. So, our story opens in Anglo-Saxon England. Originally this land was, and still is really, called Britain. But in the 5th century, large parts of the south were invaded by Vikings from Denmark and northern Germany, who settled and took over the place. These guys were the Saxons from northern Germany and the Angles from Denmark, and it's from that last lot, the Angles, that we get the name we all know today for the south of Britain, England. Now, the country may have been called England, but they certainly didn't speak a language we'd understand as English today. If you were to hear it, it would sound like German or something Scandinavian. Most of the people that lived in England at this time, and in fact most of Europe, were pretty poor and had very little freedom by comparison to what we enjoy today. This guy, for instance, he's living a life most of us couldn't even imagine. He doesn't get to go to school, so he can't read or write. There's no medicine, so life is short, and sickness kills most children before they can even get a chance to grow up. Electricity hasn't been discovered yet, so forget about Xboxes, computers and iPods. This guy can't even turn the lights on when it gets dark. As soon as the sun goes down, it's pretty much bedtime. He's what was called a serf, and he has no freedom and owns almost nothing for himself. The house and the land he lives on belong to the local rich guy, and as soon as he can walk, he's expected to go and work in the fields to help his family pay tax and rent. He's not even allowed to move to the next village without permission, and maybe worst of all, he pretty much only gets porridge to eat each and every day of his life. That's if there's even anything to eat in the first place. He is in fact little more than a slave. Could be worse, of course. He could be an actual slave. At this time, there were about 30,000 of them in England. Things are much better for this guy. He's a thane, one of the wealthy lords of England. He's rich, so he can afford much better clothes and food like meat and eggs and vegetables. Best of all, he can even afford candles, which are handmade and so really expensive at this point in time. There's a bit of a payoff for all that though. This guy is basically the local muscle and has to protect the serfs from everything from wolves to Vikings who turn up trying to nick what little stuff the serfs actually have. On top of that, he owes everything he has to the king, and if the king goes to war, this guy has to go and fight and possibly even die for him, no questions asked. The King of England at this time is a guy called Edward the Confessor, so called because he is a deeply religious kind of guy who spent a lot of his time praying and building churches. Even though he was born in England, Edward was different from the rest of the Anglo-Saxons he ruled. Edward had grown up in the country his mum came from, a part of France called Normandy. Normandy had been given to another pack of marauding Vikings 150 years previously, and the area took its name from the common name for a Viking, Northman, meaning literally a man from the north. Just like in England, most of the Normans were poor serfs. Instead of being lorded over by the still Viking-like Saxon thanes, however, Normandy was ruled by knights. The Viking invaders had taken up the French language, lots of French culture, and traded in their long ships for horses, becoming the greatest knights in Europe. They were very warlike, but also very religious and cultured. Unlike the Saxon thanes, they'd also taken to shaving off their beards and moustaches and cutting their hair short. Even cooler, they shaved the backs of their heads so they wouldn't get nits. The Normans didn't have a king, as they were technically still a part of France. Instead, they were ruled by a duke. The Norman duke was William, and he was Edward's cousin. Edward was quite a bit older than William, but William had grown up around Edward, and the two were close and knew each other well. Now, Edward was old. Eventually, he died. He hadn't had any children of his own, so the question was, who would become the next king? William of Normandy, who was Edward's cousin, was pretty confident he knew the answer. My cousin Edward promised me the crown, I will be the next king of England. Well, there was no way the Saxon thanes were going to have a foreigner become king. So they all got together and decided that Edward's brother-in-law Harold, the richest and most powerful Saxon in the land, should become king. William was furious. He decided he would fight Harold to take control of what he thought was rightly his. Problem was, he didn't have enough knights to do the job, so he sat down and wrote a letter to the Pope. The Pope was a much more powerful figure in the Middle Ages than he is today, and what he said pretty much went. The Pope decided William was in the right. He sent William a special banner, which made the invasion of England a crusade. Now knights from all over France and even the Norman lands in southern Italy flocked to William's side. The English were in proper trouble now. William assembled his troops and built a massive fleet to sail across the Channel to England, men, horses and all. Now, you might notice these look like Viking ships, and you'd be right. Remember, both the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans were Vikings who'd taken over other countries. William and his men landed on the south English coast near the town of Hastings. Harold and his army raced to meet them. The English army lined up on top of Senlac Hill. At the front, the Saxon thanes locked their great round shields together to form a wall. A wall of shields would protect the English army, making it hard for the Norman soldiers to attack them. Behind the thanes were the housecarls. Each housecarl had a mighty two-handed axe that he could swing with such deadly force it would cut a man or even a horse in half. From the top of the hill, the English army could get a good view of every move the Norman army made, meaning they couldn't be surprised. King Harold, standing in the middle of his mighty army, axe at the ready, was pretty confident he would win and keep the crown of England. At the bottom of the hill, William had lined up an army that was smaller than Harold's. You'd think that this would have meant the English would have had an easy win over the Normans, but William's army had a few big advantages over the English. For starters, William had brought lots of archers with him, while the English only had rocks and axes to throw down on the Normans as they came up the hill. Secondly, most importantly, the Norman army had a couple of thousand knights in it, men who were basically full-time, well-trained warriors who fought on horseback, while the English all fought on foot. The Norman knights were the best, toughest, scariest fighters in Europe. The battle raged all day, from early in the morning until it got dark. Again and again, the Norman foot soldiers and knights charged up the hill on the attack. In between the charges, the Norman archers fired arrow after arrow over the English shield wall, killing the men behind. Near the end of the day, his brothers dead and the battle nearly lost, King Harold himself was hit, in the eye, by a Norman arrow. 4 knights cut him down, and the battle was over. William had won, but the cost had been huge. 10,000 men from both sides were dead. 80% of the Saxon thanes were gone. England now belonged, lock, stock and barrel, to the French-speaking Viking knights from Normandy. Well, things were pretty bad for the old Saxon thanes, but what difference did the conquest of England make to the average people like our serf here? Well, he still didn't own anything much, that hadn't changed. He still had to pay tax and work for the local lord to pay his rent, so things hadn't changed much in that regard either. So the question is, had his life changed at all? Well, what do you think? I think things had changed for him in some pretty big ways. Imagine you're an English peasant. Your lord used to be a Saxon thane. He spoke the same language as you, and he shared the same culture as you. Now he's dead, killed at Hastings. Your new lord is a Norman knight, a guy who speaks French and has no interest in learning English. He shaves the back of his head and doesn't even have a moustache. Everything about him is different from you and your old lord. And because he's the boss, it's you that has to change, not him. The single biggest thing that changed in England was the English language. The English that was spoken in Anglo-Saxon times would sound like a foreign language to you or me. And it took 300 years of Norman kings speaking French to turn Old English into a language you and I would understand today, Middle English, the language of Shakespeare. Now, you probably use a whole lot of Norman French words every day without even realising it. Words like cabbage, catch, pocket, fork, garden. There's a whole lot more, too many to list here. So, there you have it. The story of 1066, the Battle of Hastings and the Bayeux Tapestry that was made to record the conquest of England. And now, maybe you see why historians think it's such an entertaining and important piece of history and why I found it so memorable when I was at school.